Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending today's symposium. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. I am just going to say a few words of health and safety before we start the day fully. There are 3 fire exits here, number 1, number 2, and number 3. They're all behind you. There are no fire exits in front of you. If there is an alarm, it will be a real one because there are no planned exercises today, and the meeting place is in the middle of the main square outside of the museum. I hope you have a lovely day, and I'd like to hand over to kick things off with Esther Fox. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Jo, for that introduction, and lovely to see so many people here today. And I hope you've had a chance to maybe look at the exhibition before you came in, but if not, please do take some time out to go and look at that throughout the day. I feel very privileged to be here today because I'm actually representing 2 major national disability projects. The first, the D4D project, and I'm going to read the long name because I often forget it. It's Disability in Community, Disengagement, Disenfranchisement, Disparity and Dissent. And we've chosen those 4 words for very specific reasons, and that is about kind of troubling some of the existing power balances and thinking about bringing change. And also the second project that I'm representing is History of Place, and that is relating to the exhibition that we have upstairs at the moment. We've been working in Bristol for over a year, more like 2 years actually, looking at a particular building with the evocatively titled Guild of the Brave Poor Things. And that was the kind of impetus to set up this symposium, really, to think about who we think of as gatekeepers, because that organisation in some ways was incredibly groundbreaking, because at the time there was no real provision for disabled people, and the founders were actually trying to do something quite revolutionary in that they were providing opportunities to learn skills, to get work and to get an education when there was no provision at that time. However, the language is obviously very troubling for us today. Most importantly, there were sort of key themes where disabled people themselves had very little really to do with the kind of management structure of the organisation. So we're looking at sort of troubling those connections today as well. Grace will talk a little bit more about all the detailed work that we've done in Bristol on the Guild of the Brave Poor Things. But one thing that's quite shocking, I think, really, is that despite there being an estimated 1 billion disabled people in the world, our history is still relatively unknown, and we're often relatively invisible, particularly in relation to being decision makers. So today is a real opportunity to start to think about how we can be more visible and how we can reclaim some of our history and think about how we can have more equality in decision making for the future. So we've got some fantastic speakers today. I'm really delighted that we've had so many people who are really doing some exciting things agree to be part of this symposium. So we're going to hear from the open storytellers. They're going to be doing a performance piece for you and to talk about how learning disabled people have had much more of a voice in the work that they do. And so will Sue Ledger, she'll be talking about that as well. And we'll also be looking at more participatory work in the collaboratory, which is at the back. And we're encouraging you to think about sort of modern technology, particularly in the field of genetics. So we've kind of been looking at the archives surrounding eugenics and thinking of where genetic screening might take us and how that may potentially make some disabled people invisible in the future. And we've also got a really interesting experience at the end of the day where we're looking at how future technology may give people opportunities to be more present and have more of a voice in the discussion. So today is not just about us talking between these four walls as well. I think it's really important that these discussions have a wider impact. So we are live streaming. We hope that many people will be joining us via that, and that we can actually start these conversations on a much wider scale rather than just what's happening in the room today. So I'd hope you have a great day, and I look forward to hearing everything that everybody's doing themselves, and I'll be summing up at the end of the day. So I'm going to hand over to Grace now, who's going to talk about the work we've been doing in Bristol.
Hello, I'm Grace Sordy. I'm the project coordinator for the Bristol part of the History of Place project. Today I want to talk to you about the research and activity that we've been conducting, but a few issues in particular that we encountered in this work. As some of you know, we've been researching into the history of the Guild of the Brave Poor Things for over a year and a half with a team of volunteer researchers. Supported by this research, we've been doing digital, artistic, and creative projects. I want to talk to you about one issue in particular that we encountered. In this project, which was the absence of disabled people's voices in the archives. I want to talk to you particularly. There we go. I want to talk to you particularly about how we faced this, how we approached it, and the things that we did, the creative projects, in order to answer these questions. As Esther has given you a background to the History of Place project, I'm not going to go into detail about all the research and activity, but I would like to give you a bit of context about the Guild of the Brave Poor Things for those of you who don't know. So the Guild was founded by a lady called Grace Kimmins in London in 1894. Ada Vachel visited the London Guild and set up a branch in Bristol. In this picture, you can see Ada sitting on steps with some committee members and a group of the young Guild members themselves. The Guild was a national organisation supporting disabled people through local groups. They would meet, socialise, go to lectures, put on performances. They'd go on holidays, on trips, and they would learn skills. The apprenticeship scheme was integral to the Guild in Bristol. They would support young apprentices to find work, and they would fund them in order to do this until they could pay the Guild back. By 1905, in Bristol, there was over 200 members of the Guild, and they started to grow out of the spaces they were using. So they designed and commissioned the build of the Guild Heritage House, which was opened on Braggs Lane. It still stands there, and the Guild operated until 1987, so working out this building for nearly 100 years. So here we had the choice building for the History of Place project in Bristol. We believe that this was possibly the first accessibly designed building in England, maybe the UK, and maybe even further. It is very significant that this building was built for the Guild themselves. Also, we can't deny the melodrama of the name itself. Just mentioning the Guild of the Brave Poor Things starts conversations about language, about charity. Did the members name it? What did they think of the name themselves? So now I'm going to talk to you about some of the key findings and discussions that we had with our researchers. I want to commend all the work that the researchers did over this project. So some of the key discussions that we had. Firstly, a sense of identity. Of course, we can question whether any building can provide a sense of identity. However, we did think that understanding a purpose-built space, even if it was not run by the disabled people themselves, but perhaps a committee, we sensed from the archives, from the voices, that there was a connection to belonging and ownership with this Guild building. we also discussed a lot the accessibility. As I said, we could question what did accessibility mean in 1913. But looking at the floor plans, we realised that this was a groundbreaking building for its time, in the sense that there were wide doors, low levels for the windows, there were wide turning spaces, practical classrooms, the ground floor was all on one level. It is significant, and we found a lot of our findings were then questioned by this final point, that this was an organisation which was very much run for the disabled people who attended. We found very little to no evidence that disabled people themselves were on the committee of the Guild. And that's not to say they weren't, because we don't know how they all identified. And indeed, Ada Vischel herself was partially deaf and became more so in life. However, in all the writings that we were looking into, the propaganda, the minute books, the annual reports, the articles, they were very much being written by the committee, who were running an organisation for the disabled people who attended. So we started to question how we would look at disabled people's history in Bristol through the lens of the Guild, and whether we should be doing it at all. Sometimes there were quotes that appeared to speak out to us from the archives, from members. However, as you can see, these were highly sentimental quotes, often picked out by committee members, largely to pull on the heartstrings of the wealthy of Bristol in order to keep their building funded. Here's an example of one, which I'm sure you'll agree is quite an unusual quote, which we find slightly difficult to read today. If you go to the exhibition, we do have an installation on language in particular, and you can see more of these quotes and examples there. I want to ask you now, yes, I will read this out. I would like to ask you just for a moment to consider these two quotes. So if the right-hand side of the room, I'm just going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and consider quote one. Quote one is, "It is so beautiful to belong to the Guild, and I couldn't unless I had lost my leg." And this side of the room, if you could turn to the person next to you and just consider quote two. "We did not know before there were such kind people in the world. God bless the friends who built for us. Every night, every morning, we pray for this." I just want you to think of some words to describe the people who may have said this, or the sentiment, or anything you might be able to conjure up when you hear these words. So you just take a moment, discuss with the person next to you, and I'm just going to ask for a few words. Okay, I'm going to ask you just to close your conversations. Okay. I'd just like to ask for a few words from people. So perhaps if we start on this side of the audience, did anyone identify any words or descriptions?
I was saying basically, if it was going back into the army, he would say to his wife and his kids, I am going back in, and if I lose my leg, I'll still be a lad, and I'll still have my kind of life, and I will always love you. I'll still be the person I am today.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've kind of created a character there.
I did, yeah.
But actually, I think the other point is that it all depends on context, because as Clemma says, actually, if you're in the army and the threat is that you're going back to war, right, then losing a leg could be seen exactly as that, as something that was quite positive. So I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Great. Any more words? Does anyone want to offer any more descriptions of these potential characters or people from the archives? One sec.
I mean, it seems to suggest that losing a leg is a good thing, which, that it's a kind of beautiful thing.
Yeah. Okay.
And we were just saying there probably wasn't any welfare state or anything at the time, so people sort of felt quite humbled and to have to receive charity because they weren't used to sort of being looked after at all and things.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sign of the times.
Great. Anyone else want to share anything from this side? Yeah.
Perhaps gaining a community can seem more important to somebody than the loss of a limb.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Liz?
Probably without the guild, he would have stayed at home and had nothing. Here
Yeah.
he had friends and potential, because, they did have a scheme to help people into work, and there were crafts to do. It must have been a lot less boring than sitting at home all day in poverty.
Similar sort of thing to what I was actually going to say was that we were having a conversation about, for some people, their life situation might have been very different, and once they heard about the guild, it was an opportunity to have a much more full experience of life, and actually also possibly to eat better. So
One of the things that struck me actually about that description of the guild and what they did was how innovative it was compared to some day centres that I've been towed around in my life, where people sit and chat, and they make crafts. And I was once towed around one whole day while a social worker tried to persuade me that it was a good thing. And she went up to all the tables and she said, "Do you like your day centre?" And they all said yes. And at the end of the day, I said to her, "You're asking the wrong questions. You should have been asking, what are your brothers and sisters doing? I bet they're not sitting around in day centres all day with nothing really to do." At least the guild gave people opportunities, some people anyway.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing this side of the room. I'm going to pass it over just so we can get some comments. This side of the room, quote 2. Did you identify anything that you thought about these characters, or any words to describe these people? Does anyone want to share? It's okay if you don't.
I thought it was quite sort of hierarchical in the way it was viewed. So it was sort of like there's these kind people who were going to look after us and things like that. And it sort of really does show that there were people who things were done for and not with, really. I mean, that's sort of the main impression that I got from the quote.
Thought there was definitely an element of propaganda in it, and that highly exaggerated to get whatever the funds or whatever.
I think one of the things that really interesting about it is that we're looking at this context over over 100 years ago. But if you travel to other countries, this is still quite commonplace. And I think that, using this to be able to look at how those things are still happening in Brazil or in Malaysia or, other places in the world, this concept is still there. This is still what's written on lots of things. And I think from that perspective, it's fascinating. It's really useful to be able to share.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for feeding all of that back. Is that off? Yeah. So that's really interesting because that raised a lot of the points that came up for us in our research. So we did start to imagine what these people might be like, what their characters could be like, this sense of belonging. But really interesting was already people starting to question, how does that compare to our lived experience today? How much have things changed? How different are they in other countries? And also, definitely, that point about propaganda, this is something that we're encountering over and over again. As much as we were trying to pull out characters or ideas or authentic opinions, it was increasingly obvious that the quotes that were being presented to us and chosen were chosen by the committee themselves and were often propaganda. I'd like to talk about some moments when we extracted what we decided or potentially looked into when we thought that there were moments of opinions from authentic disabled members because they were in opposition to that of what the committee seemed to be expressing. So there's one key example, which was about the naming of the guild. So in 1905, there was a short discussion as to the advisability of changing the name of the guild. Many people, outsiders and strangers especially, much disliking the members being termed poor things. It was thought that the apprentices would especially object to it. 1 or 2 names were suggested, such as Masters of Fate, Guild of Courage, but they did not meet with approval. We can presume here that approval is the approval of the committee members themselves rather than the members. There was a meeting in 1906 and a vote taken, but without majority, the matter was let rest for a while. In 1916, they changed the name over to the Guild of the Handicapped. That it took 10 years for this decision to be acted upon potentially says more to us about the difficulty for members or disabled people to have an impact on the management of the Guild itself. And it maybe suggests to us that there were other issues or potential disagreements with the running of the Guild, and it might have been quite difficult to raise these. Another key finding from one of our researchers that struck out to them was this suggestion that potentially Guild members might come on the committee and would be useful in making plans for developing a Guild. In 1931, it was suggested through the committee meeting. However, it was felt that by visiting and friendly talks, real cooperation and suggestions are already being got from the experienced Guild members, and that probably more constructive help was procured in this way than in the specially delegated committee members. So here is an example where we can pull out potentially that the lack of action says more to us about what was going on with the relationship between the gatekeepers, the leaders, and the members themselves. So now I'm going to move on and talk to you about some of the examples of the activity that we did in order to approach these issues. We wanted to create opportunities for disabled people and local people to express opinions on what they encountered in the archives, not directly interpret what we had extracted as opinions. We wanted to enable access to stories and a relationship to develop between participants and heritage in a relaxed or artistic atmosphere. One important example of this was a film project that we did last summer. We got together with young people who were given the archive material. They debated it, they looked into it, they played around with it, they did creative writing. They workshopped the ideas for a film and decided the focus themselves, and they were taught filmmaking skills in order to make their stories come to life. In giving the young people different quotes and different ideas, there were some that struck a chord with them, particularly acceptance or rejection from membership from the Guild. This is one quote. 2 children, suffering respectively in the head and in the ear, applied, but Miss Glanville explained that it had been such our custom not to admit such, as were merely delicate in these ways, but to concentrate on crippled limbs, backs, and blindness. This, along with other quotes to us from the Guild, suggested to us that mental health issues or learning disabilities were considered a reason for not admitting people to the Guild. Indeed, in 1926, the Minute Book also told us that M4 declined treatment and it was not possible to have her at the Guild. There were a few examples where potential signs of depression, or maybe not even just following the ethos of the Guild, was a reason that they weren't allowed to be members anymore. So the young people who'd previously expressed quite an admiration for the Guild and the work they were doing were upset by these quotes. This led to them devising lots of scenes about this, and I want to show you one in particular where they created characters all about acceptance and rejection. So this... Oh.
The Guild, yeah. I've been going there my whole life. It's a wonderful place. It's great. My people are there. It's a really great community. What about it? You said you were refused? What?
Of course, I've been refused so many times. How did you get in?
Well, it was easy. My parents wrote a letter and they said yes. What about you?
My parents would never do such a thing, and even if they did, it wouldn't make a difference. She said no to all of us.
Ada said no to you? Are you sure it was her? It must have been a different person. It can't have been Ada.
It had to be Ada.
Wait, you're talking about the same person who has the same view that all disabled people should be together, should have a community, should be educated. Doesn't matter if you are crippled, you should be able to achieve in life. Is that the same person we're talking about?
It is, but she's never been like that with us. With your part of the community, she's so open and lovely, but with mine, we're weak in the mind and work differently than others.
Okay, that's odd. I'll go ask Ada. I want to talk to her about this.
Great, so that was an example of a clip, and you can see the full film in the exhibition if you want to see more of the scenes that the young people developed. So there were other examples of when our interpretation was potentially straightforward in its idea. So there was a flag that flew in the Guild building, part of their meetings. It was very important. We also knew that when Guild members passed away, their family members were given a British flag. So we looked for a flag for our exhibition, an original from the Guild, but we didn't find one. So we thought this was a good opportunity for us to make a flag in 2017 and ask local people, groups to come together to talk about what disability meant to them today and discuss over embroidery, over stitching, just as they would have done at the Guild in their classes. So we ran a flag workshop with Debbie Bird, an artist, and people came together and they made a flag. They each made a patch and they sat and discussed symbols, imagery. You can see the final flag in the exhibition. Something that we didn't expect in these workshops was that the act of craft opened up honest voices, discussions, and as people were absorbed in their work, they talked very freely about these issues relating to them today. Finally, I want to talk to you about our digital game. We created a digital game with surface impression, and you can see some of it working today in the exhibition. We did this through workshops over the summer, again working with young people and community participants. They developed ideas again from the archives, and you can see a trail-based game which has got 4 moments in history and 4 different characters all over Bristol. The young people came up with all the ideas, and we were able to translate their reactions through the guise of digital characters, in particular, Bob, the boy on the bike. So again, the young people were inspired by particular quotes when creating their characters, and one that they were particularly encouraged by was in 1927. In the minute books, it tells us that the boys were reminded that while on club holiday, they must not feel at liberty while guests of our undenominational, unpolitical guild to go round the neighbourhood doing propaganda work of any political complexion. And they are asked to extend the guild spirit of thinking of others before myself, to matron and the maids who work so hard for their happiness and holiday. So young people imagined a slightly rebellious young boy called Bob, and in our game you can see him getting swept up in political protests and having adventures across Bristol. They developed this through just talking about their favourite digital games. They played Snakes and Ladders, we did storytelling. The character of Bob's aim in the game is to find an apprenticeship. And again, this was something young people identified with, looking for work. And they were able to talk about this and create this character Bob in order to realise these connections. So I'd like to just conclude now and say that overall you can see that we definitely extracted some opinions from the archives. We discussed what members and outsiders might have thought about the Guild. But more for us, we went through the activity, through the workshops, to discuss what our opinions now and how they relate to all of this, about language, imagery, leadership, and relating this to what spoke out to us from the archives. We never set out to represent the voices or stories from the past, but what we did want to do was enable the opportunity for opinions and relationships to develop between hidden stories and the authentic disabled people's voices, which we didn't find in the archives. We wanted to create a space for young people and local participants to ask questions like, how much has changed? How do they feel about the same issues today? We hope to address the lack of balance of disabled people's voices from the archives. And we hope that we opened up these opportunities through digital and artistic activities in order to enable participants to explore and understand their heritage. We hope that this would encourage a greater sense of self-confidence and ultimately agency. Thank you. Oh, Q&A. I think there's an opportunity for Q&A now, so if anyone's got any questions about that or about the project. Any questions?
Okay. Hi, I wonder whether...
If you could just talk into the radio mic as well, thank you very much.
I'm not sure whether the Guild was a residential project. Was everyone living there, or people came for daily classes?
Yeah, that's right. I might be easier if I walk a bit. Yeah, they didn't live at the Guild. There was a flat upstairs which was used by the warden who did live there with their family. But the Guild members came for activities, classes, apprenticeships in the day. They also had a holiday home which they would go to in the summer, which was out in the Mendips, which they went to for long summers up until 1971.
Hello, Stella Mann, Glenside Hospital Museum. I was wondering whether those people that weren't allowed to be part of the Guild ended up at Stoke Park Learning Disabilities, because there was a school and residential care there. So did you follow them through? Could you?
We could, yeah. We did encounter some names of other institutions as we were doing our research. Yeah, Stoke Park certainly came up. We didn't follow the journeys of all the people who were let in, but that could be an interesting project to kind of look into what happened to them.
Yeah. Isn't it true that at some stage they excluded visually impaired people as well?
We did find references to that at points. Yeah, it's difficult to map exactly who was allowed in when, because it seemed to be that when they got full, they kind of made quite sweeping decisions about who to let in and not at different points. But yes, initially they focused on physical impairments. They then focused on physical impairments and blindness, and then they kind of opened it up later on as well. We know that deaf members attended in the later years as well.
Thank
you. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. This isn't really a question, more of a comment really, but I was really interested. Those two questions about changing the name of the organisation, that's kind of really reminded me of all the debates about MenCap in the sort of 70s when they were trying to get rid of the little Stephen logo. But it was people with learning disabilities who were saying they wanted it to be replaced, but the kind of charity hung on to that logo because it was very effective in raising money. And also the debates more recently about people with learning disabilities being on committees and that kind of idea, oh no, but we actually meet a lot of people, so it's quite complicated. So it's so interesting the way those things are recurrent. So thank you.
How accessible is all this material? Some people actually go to the warehouse and have a look at it.
Yeah, if you want to go down, the Bristol Archives holds the archives of the Guild of the Brave Poor Things. You can see our selection of it, obviously, in the exhibition for the next 6 months. And our research that's been written up will be archived on our website as well, so you'll be able to access it through that as well in the future. There's a question at the back there.
Oh gosh. I've got loads of questions, so I try and pick one. But just to say that I spent my childhood at Chailey Heritage in Sussex, which started off as the Guild of the Brave Poor Things. So I'm completely and utterly biased in my view because it's such a big part of my life, and it made me who I am, basically. But Dame Grace Kimmins was a big figure. In fact, there's a new book. I don't know if you know, there's a new book just been published about her. Yeah, it's literally, I think, in the last week or so. So she was quite godlike. She was called the founder. And so every year we had Founders' Day. It's just extraordinary. So questions about, I haven't got a clear idea about whether these are adults only, whether there were children in Bristol. If there were children, then are there parents' voices there? I know that one of the things that happened, got Chailey Heritage started, was that, so the story goes that Dame Grace and her friends, her chums, her rich cronies, literally plucked crippled boys from the streets of London and hoiked them down to Sussex for some fresh air and exercise. Is that similar to what happened? So anyway, that really wasn't a question. So I had to say that, that I'm kind of coming to this with just my head stuffed full of knowledge and experience, but it's just so interesting to hear about it. So the parents' voices?
Sadly not in the archives that we... Thanks. Okay. There was very little evidence of parents' voices in the archives as well that we were looking into. Like I said, everything that we were encountering was account books, minute books, annual reports, articles. I would say that definitely that example of kind of going out into the streets was something in the early years, especially that Ada Fischel did. You can see an example there of a book called Visiting, which she wrote exactly about that, going and knocking on people's doors, encountering them and saying, I'll look after your children. So yes, it was very much children's groups where she would take children's groups. Originally, in fact, before she started the Guild, she ran girls' groups, and they were just called girls' groups for wayward girls. And then after visiting Dame Kimmins, she started the Guild for disabled young people. In the later years, there were actually less young people attending the Guild, and it did become more focused on the older people's groups because there were schools in the way that there weren't, obviously, in the early years. So the kind of the classes, the trips tended to be, we believe, attended mostly by older people. But certainly in the early years, the young people's and children's groups are really important. So just one question here, Elizabeth, and I'll come. Okay, thank you.
Hello, that was quite fascinating. I just wondered, having whizzed around the exhibition, there was a statement there about being excluded from the Guild if you were religious. I wondered if you could clarify the relationship to religion, and also about clearly women were involved in the leadership, but how inclusive the Guild was in terms of gender in relation, say, to apprenticeships.
Sure. Yeah, that point about religion was actually kind of came from that quote from 1927 about the boys who were reminded that it was non-denominational, non-political. So they were very clear that they weren't assigned to any particular religion, though I would say that certainly in the early years, reading from my perspective, it reads as extremely religious. Ada was kind of Methodist-based practice herself, but they weren't it wasn't supposed to be a religious group. So if people were not following the exact ideals of the Guild, that was something that they often encountered as a reason maybe not to be members. So that quote from the young people, there was a few more examples of that where people were maybe pushing agendas that didn't fit in line with that of the Guild. Certainly gender is another interesting thing we came on, because Ada herself was involved in suffrage and some of the other committee members. She raised the point, which is something we found later, with the men's groups about suffrage and what they thought women's suffrage. So the classes in the beginning were very gendered, so if you can see on the plans themselves, the classrooms were in fact split. So it was a girls' classroom and a boys' classroom on separate sides. They learnt slightly different skills, especially in the early years. It would have been more split about embroidery and about watchmaking and fixing, that kind of thing. I think a couple more.
You mentioned about apprenticeships and the idea, well, the aim of getting members into work. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
So the apprenticeship scheme was something that they set up, which was really important to the Guild life and to members who went there. So they would approach employers and they would support them in starting apprenticeships. So they would actually pay for them to do that. And you can see an example of the records of the account books of the apprentices. And then they talk about how they start to pay them back slowly. So it's really nice sometimes when picking out these apprenticeship stories and seeing how members found an apprenticeship, the Guild maybe paid for them to do that, and as their earnings went up, the kind of records throughout the years of them paying the Guild back. Interesting again, like looking at kind of the interwar period compared to the war period, about how it became easier as with women finding work in the war period. It became slightly easier for disabled people to find work. There's some accounts, and then when soldiers returned, them actually losing their jobs and having to retrain. One example of a toy maker, which you can read about in the exhibition.
Hello. I was actually interested to know how you recruited the young people to take part. I was wondering where they came from, whether any of them had been, were used to sort of being with another group of disabled people, and how that impacted on the discussions around going to somewhere like the Guild.
Thank you. Yeah. Recruited a lot of the young people through the Wessel group, because that's who I'm partnered with. So there's a Wessel youth group. So a lot of the young people in the film and the game kind of came through there. An interesting example on that is the young boy who you saw in the clip there, a BSL user who's deaf. He was really interested in talking a lot about the connection with the Centre for the Deaf, which closed down, and how the closing down of that building was a big loss of community. We actually had disabled and non-disabled young people in this group, and Kieran himself went to a deaf school, and it was really interesting just seeing those conversations between the young people who hadn't worked with other young people with necessarily with BSL users or with disabilities as well, and just even not in the workshops, just watching those discussions. So yes, we certainly, I think coming from the Wessel Youth Group, where it's a supported environment for young people with disabilities and learning disabilities, coming into a mixed group like this and running the workshops, we had a quite small group, and I think that allowed for relaxed and open kind of conversations and friendships to emerge as well. Okay, I think I'm probably really over, so I'm going to stop there because there's no hands up. So thanks.
So we've adapted our methods that we use in the theatre to create documentary theatre towards working with researchers and with communities, specifically with the kind of creative communities ethos of co-creating, co-producing knowledge. And so there's a lot of connection on collaborating and valuing equally the kind of knowledge that community members bring through their own experiences, not putting it higher or lower than the knowledge of academics. So, I put these slides together with Professor Kellerman from Keele University, and I always feel slightly shy of saying cultural animation was pioneered in the UK by Sue Moffat, because it sounds quite boastful, and we're culturally not very good at boasting. But we did need to look at how we could turn our practice into a methodology which was usable by community members and also by other academics. I've told you about the idea of cultural animation bringing people together in a space where their direct experiences and knowledge is equally valued and actually adds value to the knowledge that academics might bring in. So, when we talk about everyday experiences, we often overlook the expertise that people have in terms of knowing what their experience of the world is. Sometimes because those voices are absent, specifically in research, we overlook the value of that kind of knowledge. And also there's an absence of where that knowledge can be written about or heard about. And what's been fantastic about the connected communities work is that those voices have become more and more present and more valued. What we try to do in our space when we run cultural animation events is to create an environment which is a safe space. Now, I'm using that word with caution because actually it's not so safe that people just want to doze off and you know, become so relaxed that they disappear somewhere. But by a safe space, what we mean is that there is an equity between people. So quite often when people come in to do cultural animation workshops with us, they may not know each other. Quite often, because of the work that I do in the theatre, we work with very marginalised groups of people. They come into spaces often feeling at a disadvantage anyway. But we really want to bring people together. So people who traditionally are acknowledged as having more power or status together in a space with people who feel like they have no power and quite often no status. So our job as cultural animateurs is to create an environment where those hierarchies are dissolved. We don't necessarily break down hierarchies, we acknowledge, but also we create an environment where they can actually kind of melt away, which is a less brutal thing than breaking down hierarchies. And in a very playful fashion, often the way that's done, and I hope this doesn't put you off coming in and joining in with us, the way that these hierarchies are dissolved is that everybody is equally kind of dubious or ambiguous or kind of slightly anxious about why are we here, what are we here for, what are we doing. So those usual kind of methods that we might use in our everyday life to place ourselves in relationship to another person, well, they're no use any longer because all kinds of different things could happen and nobody necessarily knows what the rules of a cultural animation space are going to be. So we play a lot of games, and the trusting relationships are really built by everybody being in the same boat at that moment. And sometimes it's the unknown that joins us together in those relationships. But mostly it's having to collaborate, to work together very quickly on tasks and negotiate how exercises or games or work is achieved. So I'm talking here about getting up and doing things. So quite often we would start a cultural animation workshop with a game, and I can genuinely tell you that the amount of hatred directed towards me when I say we're going to play a game is a unanimous kind of experience, and I've become quite used to all of it being directed towards me. But as Plato would say, you can learn more about a person in 1 hour of play than a whole year of conversation. And our methods are very playful. They're all about kind of people discovering things about themselves through the way that they do play the games, through the way that they achieve the exercises and the tasks in the cultural animation setting. Like I say, we don't try and pretend that hierarchies don't exist, but actually we acknowledge those things. But through playing games differently, through having to collaborate with different people and create a different language that is common between people, people are allowed in our workshops to suspend the pressure of being who they are in the outside world and actually discover different things that they can bring. So for instance, a chief exec of the city council coming in to a workshop and working with young offenders, or people who are very angry that a children's centre is being closed down. Those things still exist, and normally the conversations between those people come from very fixed perspectives. In our workshop, actually very quickly, those fixed positions are changed and genuine conversation and insights are able to be gained. And through that, relationships that can be taken outside of the workshop back into the real world, and the potential then for things to be done differently is really heightened. Now, I'm going to talk about the idea of boundary objects here. So when you go into our collaboratory, you will see there that there's lots of objects. Most of them are very familiar. Some of them might be a bit strange because we come from a theatre and we can heighten the reality of ordinary objects for the purpose of theatre. But particularly what is important for us is the idea that having to choose an object and through that object tell a story, it stops people from feeling so self-conscious. It means that rather than having to kind of think of rehearsed answers to questions that they've been asked 1,000,000 times before, actually suddenly they can be quite playful and answer from the perspective of an object. But a lot of the time what we have to do is that people have to choose a particular object together to represent something. So in our collaboratory, we've looked at the idea of the presence of absence. So you would be asked to go in there and perhaps to, not just by yourself, but with another person, think of an object which represents absence or presence for you, and then justify why that object might do that job. And what happens, the picking something up or moving around and having to choose things stops people from being kind of really self-conscious about the kind of interactions and conversations that they will have. Because in the beginning, you can kind of hide behind the thing that you've chosen. The object speaks for you, but actually you can speak through the object. The idea of negotiating as well is it's a real skill that is needed between researchers and communities. So it's not just about us asking questions and answering, but it's about creating a new language between each other, where suddenly something like a slingshot becomes representative of the joint battles that people might want to need to fight together, or people might turn it upside down and decide that it represents something else entirely. But rather than me just saying this is what this object represents, it moves from the me and you into the us deciding on what the object represents. I think we've probably been involved in more than 20 research grants now with the AHRC and other ones. But the essence of our work is that from an empty space, we bring objects in, we bring people together, and through the workshop, installations are created, poems, shadow puppetry, songs, and rather than me saying this is what this theme is about, actually what happens is, although we've got the title Presence of Absence, the community that comes into our collaboratory, they will decide whether that is the theme that's the most important to them. And actually a whole new series of themes can arise. So I'll be really interested today when people come in and have a look at the things that we've got. We've presented some things in there that have come from other workshops, but always there is a space then for people to add to what's there already. Take the whole kind of theme in a new direction and also challenge us with kind of questions and ideas that we might not have thought about. So although there are things brought into the space already, actually there is always the space for new directions to be taken. And for us, it's a really important part of the work is that we never decide that this is how it's got to be, but actually create the opportunity for people to add to the themes and challenge us and challenge yourselves as to what are those complex and difficult conversations that need to be had. How can using objects and buttons and playful methods allow us to have incredibly difficult conversations? How do we turn upside down the idea of playfulness as being something frivolous and light to actually be a way of being able to connect with some of the most difficult topics that we're facing today as a society. In other words, how can those kind of unspoken ideas and fears be brought present in a workshop in a safe way, which doesn't leave people compromised, but actually empowers people to be able to rehearse those difficult conversations and then take them to the audiences that need to hear them. Our workshops are the kind of starting point, if you like, and quite often we will rerun cultural animation workshops with the same people, but also adding new people in. The stories that come out as a consequence of the workshops are very rich, and quite often people will say that in a very short time of perhaps only 2 or 3 hours, they feel very connected with each other. They form genuine relationships which mean that they want to remain connected once the workshops are over. Our job as a producing theatre is then to take those documentary stories and the ideas and ambitions of the people that we work with and create a piece of theatre where a whole new audience is then able to hear those stories and access those worlds of people that they otherwise wouldn't connect with. And through the action of theatre then, reach a broader group of people and inspire another group of people as well to take those testimonies and those stories back into their own communities. We've done this work not only in the UK, but actually across the world. So the methods are very, very simple and accessible. So there's no great science to them. Also, the beauty of cultural animation and the use of ordinary accessible objects means that very quickly communities can take the methods and the ideas back into their own communities and use them and adapt them in their own way. The reason why it's important to talk about that is that being able to create a method which transcends the need for language and then becomes based on interaction between people means that when we've taken it to, I'll just go forward a minute. Oh, taking it too far forward. So yeah, so the picture on the top left there is a picture taken in Japan. So working with the segregated community in Japan, the Burakama community, who have been ritually segregated for hundreds and hundreds of years. The University of Osaka wanted to reconnect with that community and make sure that their stories, their ideas, their knowledge was something that could benefit the whole community and that they wouldn't be segregated any longer. I was really anxious about going and working in a place that was very culturally different as well as having a different language. But actually it felt very much like being at home, because as soon as we started the games and the exercises, actually I became less and less important in the space and people collaborated and created together. What I'm really pleased about with the button exercise in this instance was that the leader of the Burakama community really saw the value of this particular exercise in telling the story of the experience of his community. And I gave him a tin of buttons and he took them with him, and the next day when I was walking through Osaka, he called me and he'd already started using the game in the cafe that he runs with people. No doubt the game will take on a completely different form in that community, but it doesn't matter. The fact is that we're creating methods which are accessible and usable and give voice to people who are normally completely absent or missed out. And the depth of understanding which is created between people through playing these games together means that a whole new language of connection is created, and also an eloquent language through which communities can make sure that the people who do have power over them understand something more about the needs, desires and aspirations of those communities. So it becomes a tool to create communication. So the pictures here is a huge community project around food and the importance of food within communities, which use cultural animation as a method for communities who use food banks, again very disenfranchised groups, to actually create a festival of food, which culminated in a weekend in a pot bank in Stoke-on-Trent, which had over 500 people kind of coming through it. And as a consequence of that piece of work, there's now an annual food festival run by the same people. And the food banks, rather than being a place, and I will say this straightforwardly because it's a quote, a place of shame and embarrassment, actually has turned around in terms of who is running those places and actually how those places interact with other people who are at that point in their lives in desperate need. So a real importance of recreating the idea of dignity and not giving to people but connecting with people. So I don't really want to kind of go too much more into the pictures here because I don't want to give things away. I don't want you as a group of people who should come in with that same kind of, I'm not sure what's going to happen in here. But I would like to, if possible, just to play a little film that was made during, I'll just come out of your way, during a workshop that Esther and I did in London at Grey Eye. It was part of our D4D project. And it shows the two kind of things that we will be looking at today in the collaboratory. An opportunity to play with the buttons, and for you to also think about what you would do with the buttons, how you could use the buttons. The idea also of the resisting perfection, writing some sanquans, and looking at the empty frames that we've got in there and thinking of who is missing or what is missing. How can you create and fill that space with aspirations of the kind of things that you would like to see made present? So Esther, I think that while the film is playing in the background, it would be really good for people to either ask me some questions or to make some comments. And I think I've got to turn this off in order to... No, I have to pass this. Yes, I have to give this. So if I finish by kind of just saying that the tradition of theatre that the New Vic comes from is documentary theatre. So we've always been very careful not to reinterpret or to tidy up the way people tell their own stories. So the rhythm and words and the language that people use to tell their own stories has always been important to us. Being a producing theatre, we have a building, which means that, you know, we're there all the time. So even when people have finished projects with us, they can keep coming back and reconnecting. And with the D4D project, in our final year, we will be hosting a piece of theatre, exhibitions and things which bring all the various streams of our project together. So, any questions?
This is just really fascinating. This isn't how people normally communicate, is it? In our everyday lives and in our groups and political groups, and I've just got involved recently in political groups, and it's just so difficult. But I wonder, there's a question really, which was about resistance. Do you encounter resistance to working in this way? And there's a question about how people are selected. Are people self-selecting? Do they know what they've let themselves in for? Just all that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Resistance, yeah, you know, there is quite often because, you know, people will feel uncertain when they come into any kind of, oh, sorry. Right, thank you for that question. I'll first of all deal with the idea of resistance. Yeah, and resistance does occur. As I was saying, from the very moment that I say, hello, we're going to play some games, you can just see the entire room kind of bristle, and those internal monologues asking the question, why did I come here today? But that's what's really important about the community animateur as a facilitator. One is to acknowledge the way that people are feeling. But I always also think that if people have actually bothered to come out of the house and get into a space, then actually, you know, there is a willingness there. And when we kind of acknowledge that we're here to collaborate together, and that things will be done differently, even like the smartest suit in the room will actually have a go. Also, all of this work is really about making something change, is doing things differently, addressing the status quo and upsetting the way things are. And that is an uncomfortable thing to do. And of course, it wouldn't be a status quo if the whole world wasn't resisting somehow. So actually we embrace that idea of resistance and just acknowledge that changing the world isn't a spectator sport. You know, we have to do things differently, and embracing that kind of uncomfortable feeling is a part of doing that. But you know, we need to read to be able to read a room and to know how far you can push and how and you know what's the most appropriate game to play and how to play it. But also a really important thing is, as facilitators, we always lead by example. We're never in a situation where we're expecting other people to do things that we're not willing or kind of doing ourselves as well. And you know, I find that once we've done those first exercises, actually that's probably the most scariest part of any workshop, is that very first thing that happens. And after we've done that, it becomes much gentler in a way, and people find their own space. It is a different way of communicating. And some people will be very vocal, whilst other people are kind of quite quietly getting on with things and contributing, but in a quite different kind of rhythm. So people are not compromised. You know, we're not expecting everybody who might be kind of quite shy suddenly to be leaping around and pirouetting or what have you. People find their own way of being able to contribute and be seen and heard. So yeah, I mean, all of the games would be very easy for people to do individually, but they would be meaningless. So always the struggle is to collaborate, to negotiate, and to also make space for people who might not be pushing themselves forward. So within the room then, quite quickly, people are looking around and beginning to make sure everybody is included in some way.
Hi, I do not know how I have missed this project, but I'm really hugely excited that it's happening, and I'd really like to have a conversation with you. My background is performance storytelling as much as anything else, and I'm interested in the relationship with how people use objects and photographs, and I've worked with people to tell stories, something around their lived experience using their own objects and photographs, and also using traditional stories, wonder tales, fairy tales, and the messages within those, in that, to explore some of those relationships. But I'm really interested to hear how it can work collectively around change. But what I haven't kind of picked up from your talk, I mean, I really want to have a conversation with you, your talk is how you might have worked with disabled people in particular with this project, and what you've been exploring.
Thank you. I'll be delighted to talk to you later, because all of the things that you've just said, just music to our ears. Actually, in terms of adding photography in, we just bought ourselves something called a sprocket, which is a delightful little thing which you can take photographs from your mobile phone and instantly print off the photos. So we've actually got the little sprocket in there, and again there's something lovely about capturing images, isn't there, whether it's images that people take of themselves or images that people take of the objects that somehow are calling to them. So at the New Vic we have a resident group of people with learning disabilities that really are part of our company, and they've been with us for kind of over 10 years. We use this method really as for those people, because a lot of people in residential care, and I hope I don't sound too controversial here, but a lot of those people end up being very grateful all the time for everything that's ever done, and quite often the spectrum of emotions that they feel as human beings are kind of reduced into a sort of being happy, being grateful, etc. And what we discovered, of course, no surprise here, is that actually everybody has a fascinating array of emotions and a sense of self which changes depending on what context people are in. So at the beginning of, say, a theatre project, we don't tell people what the story is going to be. What we do is we explore with people the themes that they would like to create a piece of theatre with, and we use the objects at the beginning of a project, this cultural animation method, for people to think about, who am I now, right now, how am I feeling, what are the things that are going on in the world that I'm bothered about, what is it, who is it that we would like to connect with in order that some things can change, and how can we do it together. And again, because these methods are not just based on language, the objects become very powerful ways of people being able to communicate kind of quite deep feelings, and also to reclaim emotions which perhaps in the pragmatic day-to-day, let's just get through the day, they kind of hide in other places. But most importantly as well is that when we then create a piece of theatre with people, how important and delightful these characters are, how much we learn. So from the New Vic's point of view, whether when Donald Trump got in, for instance, and the Strathcross group came in, they were the most political conversations that we had. Everybody else had just kind of swept it under a carpet and didn't want to talk about it. Where, you know, Strathcross group was straight out there, being really keen to express the worry, how's the world going, and what are we going to do about it? And actually, that gave us the confidence to believe that, yeah, together with this group, we can create something that is humorous, which is very human, which is challenging, and which kind of reduces the them and us into the company idea of the we. And I think that's a very important part of the cultural animation. The other really important thing about working with cultural animation and people with disabilities is the opportunity that we at the New Vic have been given through working with Esther on the D4D project, and also Martin Levinson, who's from Bath University, on two really important streams about the kind of where disability sits as a topic, how people with disabilities are included in really important conversations, which is what Esther's stream is about. And you heard Esther talking earlier, so I won't go back over there. Martin's stream is called Now You See Me, Now You Don't. So again, it's that idea of, when do people become present? Is it only when there's a problem? And where are they when they're not present? And where are they in our minds and in our planning, whether it's for future cities or whether it's about a school curriculum? But look, I know I've been given the time, the big T sign over there. I'd love you to come and join us in the collaboratory. I'm not going to make people jump up and run around and play games today because there's not enough space, but there's a lot of different ways to engage, and Rachel, my colleague, is here. Like I say, Esther and Martin are also here. So, you know, we would love you to connect with us, and also to kind of direct us in terms of what are the kind of themes and questions and ideas that you would like us to include. So I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. I just wanted to say, please do go into the collaboratory and have a look at what's going on in there. But we're also going to have lunch now. We've left quite a long lunch break because we want you to have time to explore these things. And also, if you haven't seen the exhibition already on the first floor, please do go and look at that during lunchtime. Thank you very much.
Hello. I hope you had a nice lunch and chance to see the collaboratory and maybe the exhibition. If not, if you didn't get a chance to see either of those, you can go again at 3:15 and we'll be around to talk as well. So now we'd like to hand over to the open storytellers who are going to be telling us a story, the fortunes and misfortunes of Fanny Fust.
Lero, lero, lily, bolero, bolena la. Lero, 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 lily, bolero, bolena la. There was an old prophecy found in a bog. Lily, bolero, bolena la. The country be ruled by an ass and a dog. Lily, bolero, bolena la. Lero, lero, lily, bolero, bolena la. Lero, 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 lily, bolero, bolena la. So, glasses. Just prepare ourselves a tad.
Hello and thanks for inviting us. We are from the charity Open Storytellers.
And Alice Parsley, who can't be here today, who's been the researcher on this project, working with Bristol University, talks here about the importance of history. At least we hope she's going to talk about the importance of history, provided that the slide loads. Yeah.
And I've always been interested in the Henry VIII and Elizabethan and the Tudors and the Stuarts. I've always been interested in history. History is important. It's important to each and every one of us, and it's the fabric of our being.
We are going to present an important event in the life of Fanny Fust, an heiress which was with a learning difficulty who was kidnapped by a bloke called Henry Barrowman.
And again, we have a little bit of film. Press the middle screen. Yeah, got it.
After seeing the Fanny Fust on
slideshow.
On the slideshow, well, it grabbed me. It made me be really interested, and it made me want to give Fanny Fust a voice. Fanny Fust needed a voice, and that what she went through is relevant to what happens to people who are disabled now. Mm-hmm. In the 18th century, Fanny Fust would have been tricked and conned to be taken, her money to be taken away from her because of her being so disabled, and so unaware of the dangers, and because of that she was really quite vulnerable and easy to be taken advantage of. Similar things do happen today. There are people today that are disabled in the way that Fanny First was disabled back then in the 18th century. There is now there are protections are in place to protect people who are vulnerable and unaware and can be taken advantage of. We're calling it Fanny's Law because well, it's relevant and it starts with Fanny.
We have been working on the story with John and Josie and Andy from Bristol University. Here we all are researching dress and fashion, finding out about lifestyle.
Now, we come now to the Commission of Lunacy, which is what we are going to be presenting to you today. So the Commission of Lunacy was a formal procedure, a bit like an inquest. It actually happened in the New Inn in Dowry Square here in Bristol. It's no longer an inn, but you can see it is still a private house and you can view it. And it was these were taken out in order to discover whether effectively individuals had capacity or would be formally and legally deemed incompetent of managing their own affairs. So typically as a lunatic or an idiot. So the way that we're going to be doing this is that we've distributed some evidence statements throughout the audience. And when the commission starts, when you're invited by the commissioner, one Henry Hobhouse, who is even now going to come up to the stage, bearing his microphone, when you're invited to, because we're a bit short of time and we need to pass the mic round, if you could just stand up and read out your statement. So if everybody can stand up at the same time. Now, if you happen to be sitting on a chair and you've been given a statement and you can't stand doing this kind of thing, please just pass it to a willing hand next to you, in front of you, or behind you. These statements are very interesting. They are from contemporary accounts at the time. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Henry Hobhouse, who is going to take this over and will use this for the time being. Could I ask the three other commissioners, please, to come up on stage? That's Francis Ward, Jeremiah Osborne, and actually I can't remember the third. James, thank you. No, you're in totally the right place. And we're going to position you up here, so we should have, there was one other person who kindly volunteered to be part of this commission, who seems not to be here. Well, if you would volunteer, that would be fantastic. Here we go. Well, in front of us is Fanny herself, who was present at this commission. And on either side of the commission is Mrs. Anne Fust, seated here, and Henry Bowerman. Gents, ladies, may I present myself? One Henry Bowerman. Yes. Carry on, Mr. Hobhouse. I think I'm going to stand. Okay. First, we will hear from the plaintiff, Mrs. Anne Fust, and then from the defendant, Henry Bowerman. Then I will invite the audience to stand and read the evidence statements they've brought to the commission. Then the members of the commission will speak to Miss Frances Fust herself. The audience will then discuss the verdict and will be invited to raise their hands to show agreement. Mrs. Fust, yes. please state your case.
I think Henry Bowerman married my daughter without her consent, basically, and I don't think he's a nice man.
This is completely untrue. Please wait.
And also, he says that I got her drunk when really he got her drunk and persuaded her without her consent to marry my daughter. What kind of man does that?
Mr. Bowerman, please respond to these allegations. Well, it's completely, anybody can see that my delightful darling Fanny and I are in love. As soon as I saw her, I knew that she was the one for me. She loves me. She's always loved me.
Preposterous.
What you will hear is Mrs. Fust putting the worst possible case about the disabilities so-called.
How dare
that
you?
Mrs. Bowerman, my wife, has. So she says she's incapable, but frankly, ladies and gentlemen, what happens is that this woman keeps her plied with strong drink. When she was with me, she was perfectly competent and capable because I never allowed her to touch alcoholic drink. And Frank, you know what it's like? It's like here, when people go, those people who are scamming benefits, you all know about them, don't you? They go up there, and the government is quite legitimately saying that they're going to take away their benefits because they're perfectly capable. And what they do is that they put forward the worst possible case just so they can hang on to the money. I know you've all seen the newspapers. I know you've seen those cases. And it's exactly the same here. My darling Fanny is more than capable of agreeing and consenting to be my wife. And we were perfectly happy on our little honeymoon in France before she said,
You forced her to marry you, you fool.
Members of the public, now please stand and read your evidence loudly and clearly. Again. Yes.
When out in a storm and seeing the lightning, she called out in a very childish manner, "Do it again," meaning that the people with her should make lightning again.
Her intellects, although weak, are not, of all the others, the most marked by imbecility.
The young lady who lately eloped from Bristol to the continent with the son of Mars. Do it again?
Yes.
Do it again?
Son of Mars, that's me.
Son of Mars. The young lady who lately eloped from Bristol to the continent with the son of Mars.
Unable to dress herself or put on stockings, not from want of strength, but from the weakness of her intellects.
She's incapable of preserving herself from any kind of danger.
Though she had been long at school, she never could read more than a few passages in Scripture.
Quite an idiot, never having had the conduct of herself or being capable of any rational exertions.
She had assented to and was concerned in planning the scheme by which they went off.
She was taken into France by the contrivance of the defendants and married to Mr. Bowerman against her will.
Outrageous!
Anybody else want to speak on this subject?
Capacity of acting and perfect reason and understanding.
She had expressed a regard for him and consented to go with him to France.
Not in the least mortified in being deprived of her lover.
So, members of the Commission, Would you care to ask Fanny some questions?
Fanny, would you hand over your large property for these 4 or 5 coins here in my hand?
Yes.
Thank you.
Madam, did you consent to go away with this man, Henry Bowerman?
Yes.
Madam, were you forced to go with Bowerman against your will?
Yes.
Ask her why she went to France. Ask her why she went to France, Hobhouse.
Why did you go to France? Strawberries and cream.
Strawberries and cream. You see this gentleman, Francis Ward.
Yes.
Would you like to marry him?
Yes.
And this gentleman, Jeremiah Osborne.
Yes.
Would you like to marry him?
Yes.
And this is James Hughes. Would you like to marry him?
Yes.
Members of the public, acting as the jury, please discuss this case with your neighbour and decide on your verdict. Whether this young lady has the capacity to consent to marriage and to govern her own affairs. You have 2 minutes for this discussion. Discuss. We will discuss. Okay. I don't know what you are. Sorry. It's like an ice cream. Can you get rid of her? Can you get rid of her? Get rid of her. All she's doing is she's just getting in the way. Right? If you just let me talk with Fanny, I'm afraid that I can't take sides. So what do you think, members of the commission?
I would say that I think she's been taken for a ride.
Yeah, she's been manipulated.
Fanny, do not talk to this preposterous man.
It is trafficking.
Let me take your... What do you think?
I love you so much.
I love you so much.
Your heart is saying you're not
Look, you've ring. Why ring on your finger?
He wants to marry you. He don't want to marry you. He didn't want to marry you. He forced you. You need to come with me. You need to come with me, my darling.
Well, I don't know.
I'm not the one that got you drunk. He got you drunk. Your mother. Not Mr. Barr. Me. Your mother.
Okay, members of the public. Members of the public. Does the young lady have this capacity? Those who think yes, and that she is indeed Mrs. Henry Bowerman, please raise your hands. Those who think no, and that she should return to the care of her mother, Mrs. Anne Fust, please raise your hands. This is a stitch-up. Result of the Inquisition taken at the house of Thomas Nichols, viticular, situate at the Hot Wells in the parish of Clifton, in the county of Gloucestershire, aforesaid, commonly called or known by the name of the New Inn, on Friday the 16th day of November, in the 28th year of the reign of our Sovereign Lord George III, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, and so forth, and in the year of our Lord 1787, before Henry Hobhouse, Esquire, James Hughes, Francis Ward, and Jeremiah Osborne, gentlemen, His Majesty's Commissioners. The good, honest, and lawful men of the county of Gloucester say that the said Fanny Fust is at the time of taking this inquisition a lunatic or of an unsound mind, and does not appear to them to enjoy lucid intervals, and therefore is not capable of the government of herself, messages, lands, tenements, goods, and chattels. And the jurors aforesaid upon their oaths further find that the said Fanny Fust will also become entitled after the decease of her mother to the family heirlooms and to a personal estate nearly to the amount of £70,000. This ends the commission of lunacy. You haven't heard the last of this, let me tell you.
Preposterous man.
Thank you, Commissioners. Your work has been brilliant. So, what actually happened? Well, you'll be glad to hear, given your verdict, that in fact it was one of these cases that has a happy ending. So although Bowerman contested the case and appealed against the decision in a case that dragged on for 4 years, Fanny was actually given to the care of her mother and later a cousin. And she did, in fact, inherit the substantial property of Hill Court in Gloucester and died at the age of 69, which was a pretty fair age, I think you'll agree. Now, considering Fanny's story today, what we've been looking at is the Mental Capacity Act, so-called what we call Fanny's Law. And actually, it was a surprise to all of us that this does not cover marriage and sexual relationships. And these turn out to still be a huge issue. So we have cases of very, very difficult arranged marriages. We have at least 2 appalling cases where young women with severe or moderate learning difficulties were in abusive relationships but were deemed to have capacity and so nobody could do anything, as well as cases where young people or people with learning disabilities wanted to get married genuinely and social services stood in their way. So these issues have not been resolved at all. We've been learning a huge amount through this collaboration. Wonderful working with Josie and John from Bristol University. We've looked at all sorts of different things. And we've learned a lot too about researching together. And these statements come from our colleagues at History and English Department, who said that they've discovered the critical importance of narrative and of place in kind of grounding history. So, in conclusion, where next? And we'll leave these words to Alice.
We're going to be...
What? I'll just say that what she says is, don't worry, actually, we'll just load through. So what Alice says is that we're going to be using this story to give Fanny a voice. And one of the things, actually, a slide that got missed, is that we thought that Fanny actually, although her voice is not heard, you can infer a lot about her. So one thing is that her mother did not want to take out the Commission of Lunacy. She is on record as saying she wanted to preserve the independence of her daughter. We think that statement, that lovely statement about how when she heard the lightning, she clapped her hands and said, "Again, again." She was, we think she was an adventurous spirit who probably rather enjoyed her trip to France. At least when the agents caught up with her, they described her as being quite happy, relaxed and calm. We know also that she seems to have had a lot of resilience in situations that others of us might have found exceptionally challenging. And she's persistent and she remembers. Why did she go to France? She was promised strawberries and cream and she never got them. And what we're going to be doing on Tuesday at the fire station, the Brigstow Showcase, because this project is generously funded by Brigstow and HLF, is that we're going to be giving Fanny and other people strawberries and cream. We're going to be staging the abduction, the plot, and many other activities for kids, as well as a lot of dancing and singing. So please, if you are around in Bristol between 10 and 4 on the 24th, do come and join us. It's drop-in, and we would love to see you.
Yes, you would, yes.
Yeah, and we're working to a performance which will be toured, we hope. So thank you very much indeed, And I'm going to invite Sue Ledger to come up on the stage and talk about some other work that we've been doing.
Disability research group based at the Open University. We're an inclusive research group, so it feels very strange for me to be here on my own, because normally there's a big team of us. But I'm going to be talking today about some work that we've recently been doing to include people with learning disabilities in archives. But I'm really pleased to be here. It's such a great event. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a real privilege. So we've just heard there from the wonderful open storytellers about the fabulous story of Fanny Fust. What I'd like to do now is kind of time travel you forward to the present day, 230 years after Fanny's abduction, and to share some work we've been doing about how archives can be made more inclusive to people with learning disabilities, and in particular, people like Fanny Fust, who might find it harder to communicate and where there may be concerns about their capacity to consent. And the work I'm going to be talking about is part of a bigger project called the Inclusive Archive of Learning Disability History Project. And that's been a national project that's employed people with learning disabilities as academics. And it's got lots and lots of different strands to it. So people have been taught some research methods. People have been doing their own research into learning disability history. People have been then reacting to that history and doing performances, theatre, filmmaking, rap videos. But time is short today, so I'm not going to talk about all of that, but please do ask me if you want to. And I'm going to concentrate on the strands of work that we did that seems really relevant to Fanny's situation. The open storytellers said, really importantly, that Fanny's voice was missing in the story. So although we've pieced things together from the official records, the person at the centre of the story, where's her voice? And what we were looking at in research is what's happening today and what we can do to try and move things on. So, right, I'm now going to introduce you to a cutting-edge bit of our research tools, so which is what we've called the left out. Can I give you one end? Well, I'm going to just have to adjust this. The left out or leading tug of war. And this, normally there's a lot of us doing this, but what we've actually found is when we're working as a team and working nationally, we've used this to try and think through when we come across an archive situation, is this helping lead, or is it are people feeling left out? And a bit like Sue was saying this morning, people often come with objects to remind them of what's happened, and then they tell their story in the group about what happened when they went to the archive. Did it feel leading or left out? What was the story they came across? So perhaps I'll just try it out on you too. So when you were researching Fanny, how did you find her voice? You've told us it was missing. Yeah. Do you think she was completely left out?
No, I don't think she was completely left out, because one of the interesting things about doing the commission is that we've realised how actually the commissioners took a great deal of care with the kind of questions they asked her, and she was actually present there at the time. And if you think of the number of reviews and situations where people with learning disabilities are not present for that kind of meeting, that's actually been quite interesting. So although she didn't lead, clearly the fact that she was actually there kind of pulls it a little bit the other way.
Pulls it a bit more my way.
Yeah.
So the objects we'd have had was the thinking around Fanny being actually there at
Yes.
the commission.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
And we've used it for all sorts of ways of sharing information, and it's been really helpful when people have come together from different projects all over the country to tell their stories. We'll return to this once I've told you a bit more about the work, and I'm going to, thank you, ask you then. So like I was saying, the project I'm talking about today and the research we've been doing is just to give you a bit of context, was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the key aims of the project were researching with the wider heritage sector to explore how archive collections, and that could be physical collections as well as online archives, can be made more open to people with learning disabilities as either users or depositors. Like I've said, a strand of the work that I was leading was researching how people with the highest support needs can get involved in sharing stories and depositing materials. And really importantly, working with people with learning disabilities to reflect on how people can lead in curating their own cultural heritage. So that led to people, as I said, putting on various exhibitions. So how did that all work in practice? Sounds great, but actually make the logistics, I thought I'd just quickly explain. There was a core research team, which was made up of learning disabled and non-disabled academics. Then there was a network of self-advocacy project partners who were paid researchers on the project. And the picture there, there's Carlisle People First and the Woodbine Group from East London. And then we held inclusive workshops with our bigger archive community, and that was people from museums, people working in archives, performers, health and social care staff, families, advocates. So just, as I said, talking about the work we did on researching how to make a depositing pathway for people with learning disabilities of high support needs. But just want to say a little bit about terminology here. That when we say high support needs, we're talking about people with learning disabilities who've perhaps got extra needs, and that might be they have physical impairments, or it might be they've got complex health needs, or they're living with labels like challenging behaviour or profound and multiple disability. And sort of back in the 80s, when people first got going, I don't know if people remember that, there was a big thing of T-shirts that said label jars, not people. And as an inclusive research team, we feel very strongly that's the case. But the archive was researching what would help people access archives and what causes them to be left out. And when we looked at learning disability services, we could say that labels were playing a big part in actually determining the opportunities for people. So one of our research group, Dorothy Atkinson, has made a really good point, I think, saying that the life stories and histories told by people with learning disabilities themselves have a really important role to play in actually counterbalancing those stereotypes. And so what we hope is by doing this work to really challenge who can and can't be included in archives, it's contributing to seeing people differently and challenging those stereotypes. So, little guessing thing now. As part of the project, we asked archivists throughout England and Wales to tell us, just to get a baseline, how many stories they had in their archive collections that were told from the perspective of somebody with learning disabilities who had high support needs. Not records about them, like medical records or social work reports, but something like a photo or a film or a story, something told from their perspective. So maybe just turn to the person next to you and just have your best guess, and I'll... Total number across the whole of England and Wales in the archivists we asked. Long enough? Okay. A lot of guessing going on. So people want to give me some guesses?
Next to none.
Sorry?
I said next to none.
Hold that thought. Anyone else? Any other? 5 to 10. Next to none? 57. Could be we were asking the wrong archivist, but we did ask a lot.
I would have thought under 100.
Under 100. Interesting. This is people, as I've described, with high support needs. They couldn't find any examples in any of the archives. So you were naught is what we came back with, none. So the situation with Fanny Fuss 230 years ago, we were starting this project in 2014. So we know from that experience, and of course there may be archives that have got them and we just didn't, we didn't pick those up. But the lived experiences of people with high support needs or profound and multiple learning disabilities are underrepresented, even possibly not represented at all, in archives across England and Wales. Some archives hold medical records and reports written by doctors, managers and social workers and teachers, but this is definitely not the same as the stories told by the people themselves in the way they would tell them. These stories are missing. So we made a start on this by, again, going back to our big inclusive, we call them kind of sandpits, where people came together, a bit like Sue Moffat was saying, to sort of play about ideas and think together. Because we actually needed to make sure that people with high support needs did want to be in archives, because it's no good us trying to move things on if people were saying, no, that's a terrible idea. So we consulted with lots of people. And we got a very clear message back that people, yes, they did want to be involved. They thought it was very important that they could belong to these communities, that their stories could be told in all different ways. And then you see a picture here of Carlisle People First Research Group leading us to make a roadmap about their ideas of how we should be taking it forward. And the next thing we asked them was, what are the barriers that are stopping you being involved? So these people with high support needs and their advocates, families, health and social care staff working with them were saying very strongly, yes, we want to be involved, we'd like that. There were concerns about would it make people more vulnerable, what would people be trolled, with some very practical concerns. But what do you think the barriers were from, so perhaps talk to the person next to you again, come up with 2 or 3 best guess barriers. What might be stopping people like Fanny today being included in archive collections?
Gatekeepers.
Okay. Do people want to just fire me some examples of barriers you came up with?
Gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers? In what way? Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, families, social workers, whoever, who assume they won't have anything to say, therefore don't ask or don't give them the opportunity to say.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really important.
Patient confidentiality.
Yeah.
As a museum, we come across that all the time.
Yeah, worries about confidentiality, worries about legality. Any more?
Awareness that actually is being collected in archives.
Sorry?
Awareness that an archive is being collected.
Yeah, exactly. Knowing it that these people are even out there ready to give their stories, the connection, that's really...
Or what are they seen as trivial and unimportant?
Yeah, would they have anything to say? Are these, legitimate contributors to heritage?
Not using appropriate forms of communication in order to get those stories.
That came through extremely strongly. Well, how do you communicate with people? So I'll show you now. I won't read these all out because I know time's short, but these were what people were saying in the in the consultations we had. I'll just call out a few of the key ones, just as been picked up. Worries about how to communicate people. Total confusion about the law on mental capacity, as touched on by the open storytellers. Worries that sharing stories may put people at risk. Would it cost a lot of money? Wouldn't that mean masses of extra resources? Archivists have never taken deposits from people with high support needs. So, you know, how do we do it? How do we make the law work with our consent processes in the archive? And overall, a feeling that getting your head around this was just all too much, and actually it's probably best to stick with it. You know, just can't really. How do you communicate with someone and then fill in the forms, and how do you do the forms if the person doesn't have capacity? We also asked them while we were at it, well, what would really help you? What do you want? And that was, again, really, really pretty unanimous. What would really help would be something that we knew was legally compliant, but told very simply, step by step, that's easy to follow, but keeps the person right in the centre. It's written from the perspective of the person with high support needs. And that, in terms of research, then we thought, well, the best thing to do would be to start very small and use a case study approach where we could actually work very carefully with somebody with really complex needs and let them lead the process, because we don't know. This is completely new work. As part of getting ready for this work, we did a role play. We invented all sorts of role plays and took them out to archivists to explain how the Mental Capacity Act works, because we knew we would have to stay within the current the legislation about decision making. We may have concerns about the way it's done with best interest decision making, substitute decision making, but we had to work within the legal framework to get that we have at the moment. And funnily enough, when we did it to archivists, they said, well, that's very straightforward. If we'd known that, you know. So this is Cherry. It's a young woman who lives in the Brighton area. She's an artist. She's exhibited in her local area and nationally. Cherry has a degenerative condition, and that means at the moment she isn't able to use language. She's starting to use eye gaze technology. She's got a large circle of people around her. She'd already, as I said, exhibited her artwork locally, and her work appears in this book. So she'd already got a publication. She'd also done some work recording, using pictures and video to record her own life story with one of the PhD students on the project. And she was her and her circle of support were really interested in exploring the idea of her contributing to her local archive. So what did we do? The law tells you the sort of expression is maximising capacity. That just means you have to do everything you can to make the decision as clear as possible to the person with higher support needs, to help them make a decision. So we knew that Cherry particularly likes information in photographs and films. So initially we made a film about the local archive, and we showed that to Cherry. She seemed very interested in it. So we went with Cherry to the local archive. We had a tour of the archive. The archivist prepared for that visit carefully, because Cherry was an artist. She picked out things that she thought would be of interest. She picked out things from the art collection that were very colourful. We looked at these in an exhibition room. And Cherry brought her own artwork and cards to try out depositing, just physically go through what it would be like handing over things. And we did this on 5 or 6 visits. Then we had to weigh it all up. The law, requires you, if you're making a decision, you need to think what's good about depositing, what's bad about it. Cherry was practicing using her eye gaze program. This is all written in the first person with Cherry and her support circle, because that's what we wanted to make a resource that was accessible to people with high support needs and their families and their support circles. And the decision which she made when we weighed it all up was to go ahead and deposit at the Keep archive. So Cherry's box of photographs, cards and stories. What she wanted to deposit was the selection of cards from her 30th birthday, which is actually 132 cards, which I thought was pretty impressive. And she put her art book. So that's now in the collection. And interestingly, it's been catalogued with local artists, not with a person with a disability. I don't know how we're doing for time. I was going to show a film just to give you a feel of the actual work and show you that. And in the film, you'll see 5, it's very handheld camera, so bear with us, but you'll see 5 clips. First of all, you'll see Angela, Cherry's mother, talking with Cherry about how she likes to communicate. You'll see a clip from the film we made about the archive to show Cherry. You'll see Cherry watching the film, and from that we thought she seemed interested, so we then organised to go to the local archive. We'll then see her visiting the archive, and then Cherry's mother at the end talking about what it was like to be part of this case study research. Or not.
So we're going to have a conversation now, Cherry, about how you like to set conversations up, and perhaps for somebody who's coming into your life new and doesn't know a lot about you, how they can help you to help them find out about it. Yeah? And you're actually very interested in this process. So I think first thing to say is just got to want to have a conversation with you. Yeah? And of course, you can't really tell people all about your stories, not with words. So kind of need things that you can respond to. And one of the things that you respond to very well is when you share watching a video or looking at pictures with somebody.
Cherry, these are just only some of the treasures that we look after at the Keep. There are more yet to come as communities change and people live and produce work, and they want to share their experiences. So I'd like to invite you to come over to the Keep and have a look at these and anything else you'd like to. And you know, we still have empty spaces in our rooms, and these are the spaces for the future, for all of the experiences and stories that are yet to come.
Noise, isn't it? That.
Perhaps just mention that we did get ethical approval to video this because we felt it was so important that other people were watching the film, judging with us if Cherry felt it was of interest to her. So we felt that was really helpful in the methods we used. And this is Cherry taking the book I just showed you to the archive, and the point here was we really wanted to see how she would feel about sharing with an archivist that she'd never met before. We knew that she was very comfortable sharing her artwork with members of her family and friends, but she'd never met the archivist before. So again, we were trying to test out that notion that sharing in an archive is sharing with strangers. And here we are, as I described earlier, we're in the sort of exhibition room where we've all got gloves on and we're handling some of the collection which was from local artists. We're in the strong room here. And Angela is Cherry's mother.
And it was important that nobody had a sense in which they were trying to make it absolutely definitive. You know, this is the perfect, the only, this is the absolute way. So what was nice is that we were all able to kind of feel heard, and that we took enough time to really change our minds if we wanted to, think about things in a different way, kind of try things out that maybe worked or didn't work. You know, not getting it right, but getting it to start to happen. Once it starts to happen, you learn from that, don't you? You don't learn from knowing about it ahead of time when it's such a new and undone thing, you know, never been done before. So, that's what you call cutting edge. Do it.
I think that's a really interesting point that Angela made there. Sometimes it's about getting it started. It's when you start the work that people with high support needs are able to show the way and lead in research, but we've got to start. It's a bit like what Sue was saying, Sue Moffat, this morning about perfection can be very kind of inhibiting, and I think for us it was really important just to start and see what happens and just try things out. So just, I won't go through all the detail, but just to let you know, because it was such a new area of law, the Mental Capacity Act is normally used in situations where people are making decisions about whether or not to have surgery or whether or not to move to a different kind of residential care home. So we sought specialist barrister advice on whether actually, because I think people perhaps hadn't anticipated, people like Cherry, giving to archives, contributing to heritage, and what is the legal framework that made that possible. And the information we got, the advice we got is very encouraging. They felt the pathway was fully compliant. And they also drew our attention to recent case law, which is emphasising that if you're weighing up the pros and cons under law, you can look at things like altruism and it being part of your local community as sort of giving back as something that's definitely in your best interest. So that was really helpful. As I've got a lot more information on that if people are interested. So I won't put you through the tug of war again, but if we were doing that, we're talking about it in that situation. I'd just be interested to know, do you think that's on the right lines? Do you think we're moving a bit forward with that piece of research and involving people? So instead of pulling across the floor. And I mean, these are the feelings from everyone about why this is so important. And these themes have gone through the day, our time together. But definitely through Cherry and her family, just to pick one out, the opportunity to meet people, to be part of the local community and national collections, and to belong was of huge significance. And I think really importantly that today's stories are tomorrow's history. So if some people continue to be excluded, then the archives, as the point made by the open storytellers, they're not showing us the full story. Thank you very much. And thank you for Cherry and Angela, who gave their permission for me to share all the films, and all the various people here are a massive part of this piece of research. Thank you. Don't you got time for questions, or do we need to? Oh, I'm going to be around if people.
Yeah, or maybe we could take maybe one or two questions.
Yeah, sure.
I'm a little more confused.
Uh-huh.
What did she deposit?
Oh, sorry. She deposited this collection of artwork, and she had actually done a number of paintings in this book. So this book was deposited by Cherry in the Keep and catalogued with local artists. But she also deposited a collection of birthday cards, which the Keep were quite interested in as a period piece of what birthday cards looked like in 2014. But it also, as her mother and her group said, that shows that it kind of challenges the stereotypes of people with high support needs, because Cherry had 130 cards. She had a network of people around her, so it was almost like a different story being told as well.
Well, the reason that I'm confused, and I kind of understand the consent here, that's a published book.
Uh-huh.
Now, there is 6 libraries in the UK that every published book, the British Library, the Scottish Library, National Library of Wales, the National of Northern Ireland, the Bodleian Library, they take a copy of every single book that's published. So I'm not quite seeing, apart from the birthday cards, what is new.
Yeah, I think that was interesting, and we had that discussion actually. Is it because actually people can obtain the book, they can buy the book? We had to check with the artists as well. But I think what the archive felt with the book would act as a useful signpost to Cherry's work. So there was also the idea, because this is ongoing now, Cherry's still depositing and building up her collection in the Keep. And so there was an idea about whether or not we could move on from the book and do more consent work to see if Cherry could then do a signpost to the group that's going on with this local group of archive artists, many of whom have got high support needs. Does that make sense? So almost like the book was adding, like, flagging that there was somebody with high support needs in the area who was a local artist whose work wasn't featuring on the Keep's index of local artists. So that was almost like a signposting mechanism. Does that make sense?
Is it recorded as having been deposited by Cherry?
It went through then. After this, we had to then navigate all the Keep's own consent forms, which again was we took it to the stage of the decision making. The Keep then have to think about how their own consent process, which is a nightmare of barriers, isn't it, can sort of dovetail with the Mental Capacity Act. But yes, it is down as Cherry.
But as something that was deposited by her, it becomes a different item than just a book on a shelf.
Yeah, and it was then linked to their collection. So when you search under local artists, she should come up if, once they...
Hi, Sue, I was just actually quite interested because I live in Brighton and I have a connection with the Keep, but with the mass observation organisation. Suzanne Rose is currently doing a project called Beyond the Boxes, which she's working with 3 different groups of people. There's 2 things. Firstly, be interested to know how many learning disabled people you're hoping, or people with high support needs you're hoping are going to contribute, and how that is going to be developed. Because I think you must have been working with different people at the Keep, because I think I would have heard about this through Suzanne. But actually, what Suzanne is trying to do with mass observation, which some of you may know is kind of an organisation that observes different situations throughout a year and have what they call directives to respond to and observe to. But they also have a diary day every year on the 12th of May in which they encourage anyone to deposit things in. And I know that they're really quite keen to include disabled people within that. So I suppose really I ought to make sure that everybody here knows about that. And I think, because I know that they want to keep those, they're starting with their projects quite small because she's working with 3 different groups in the Brighton kind of area, one of which is Blind Veterans UK. But it just sort of makes me think that's quite an interesting approach that she's taken. I just putting it out there, really.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds fascinating. And the idea of having a day when people are invited to deposit, that sounds a perfect next step for the Cherry Pathway. In answer to your question about what happens next, the funding for this, it was a 3-year project, and it took us an awful long time to go through the ethical approval process to do the work. So in the project we just did, we wanted to take it at a slow pace, and we did just 1 pathway with Cherry and got the legal pathway approved. What we'd like to do now is to apply for follow-on funding where we can try out the pathway with more people with high support needs. But that idea of linking that to a depositing day or days and throughout the country would be lovely. And we were also thinking really hard about how would we engage with the point that somebody made about the barriers. How would we engage with these people who are often very hidden in communities? And you don't really want to be engaging people just because they've got high support needs. You want to find a way in people who are interested in topics. So we need to think really carefully how we do the next stage. Thank you very much.
We're just getting set up. This is going to take a little bit of technical jiggery-pokery. So can I please ask, if anybody's using any Wi-Fi connections, would you mind turning them off at this moment, please? So if your phone's linked to the Wi-Fi in the room, please turn it off. It's the guest line. And that's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to spoil the surprise.
Okay. Okay, I'll put it on my neck. Okay. Yeah. And so good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation, Esther. We'd like to introduce ourselves. We're doing something which I think is a first for Bristol. I'll let Miro Griffiths introduce himself first. Miro?
Okay, can you hear me okay? Great, okay. So yes, so my name's Miro Griffiths. I'm a researcher at Liverpool John Moores University. I particularly research around disability studies, social movements, activism, political ideology, and so forth. I'm based in Liverpool, and due to my access requirements and probably cost, and also in terms of my diary, I probably wouldn't have been able to be in Bristol today. So this is where the technology comes into it, because I'm now sitting in my office at home, and I've been listening to the whole day of through the presentation through this robot. As a way of navigating around the environment, listening to people's conversations, and so forth. And it's a really immersive experience, which I can obviously explain a little bit further as we go through our talk today. But yeah, as Esther said, hopefully the technology should be stable. If during the presentation you start to dislike what I'm saying, then you can just start logging onto Wi-Fi, and eventually I'll disappear. But no, I'll hand over to Praminda.
Thanks, Miro. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, a little bit faint.
Okay,
but
maybe
it's okay.
come a bit closer. We've just got to know each other in the last 3 weeks, but so we're just discovering our personal space. I'm Praminda Caleb-Solly. I work at the Bristol Robotics Lab at the University of West of England. I'm Associate Professor of Enabling Technologies. I have also got a position at Designability, and we're an assistive technology not-for-profit charity. We develop a range of assistive technologies. And for me, this is a very exciting opportunity to do this. So the research that I'm involved with is to identify and understand how robotic technologies such as this and others that we've got in our lab can empower people and give them more agency. However, there are a range of ethical issues, legal issues, and understanding from a psychological level of how these technologies should be deployed, what we need to do to improve them, what are the issues that we need to consider. So today, I hope in the next 40 minutes or so, Mira and I are going to explore some of these issues. So we had a lot of interesting points to discuss about this, and we started off by brainstorming on quite a few themes. Mostly, I should say, it was you, Miro, who were thinking about this, because I have one view, which is my view as an engineer and somebody who's interested in user experience of this technology, but of course, Miro's experience is personal. And so, out of all the themes, we've selected 3. And so, if I go to the next slide. So these are the 3 themes that we've selected. We're going to explore how these technologies can be used as a mechanism to participate, and thinking about what participation actually means in different contexts. Our second theme is going to be about what the impact is going to be on the provision of human support. So one of the issues that emerges every time we have a discussion about these technologies is what happens to human-human relationships and contact. So that's one of the themes that we're going to look at. And then the third theme is very close to my research. It's about the usability of these technologies. So it is not just about making these technologies available to people, it's how easy they are from an accessibility point of view. And we'll explore that as well. Oh, sorry, am I holding everything close to me? Can everybody hear me? Okay, okay. So we'll start with the first theme. We've given ourselves about roughly 10 minutes for each theme and left 10 minutes for questions. So maybe somebody who can keep time to make sure we don't sort of go over and let us know when we've reached the end of the first sort of 8 minutes now for the next theme. Okay, so we started off by thinking about various questions about each theme, and we've brought it down to 2 questions per theme. So the first question is, how will access to this technology affect the social status and position of disabled people within society? So Mira, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I can do. So I think based on what we've heard today, as well as our knowledge around disabled people's life chances and so forth, I think what is very clear is that disabled people have reduced life chances and have a history of marginalization and exclusion. So using technology like this, I think opens up a range of opportunities for disabled people to use in order to access different parts of their daily living, whether that's keeping or gaining access to employment, accessing learning environments to progress through, say, school or further education or higher education and so forth. But without being a little bit too prescriptive around what this technology can do, I think it's quite interesting at this stage to think about how it will reshape the significance and the importance of having disabled people in environments where they weren't able to access before. And I think that kind of disrupts our idea of saying being physically there in that environment is the best solution for everybody. Because actually, for me, this is a little bit less draining in terms of my energy. It means that my access needs can be met in a way that I want them to be met. I'm not necessarily confined to the limitations of the building and so forth. But the problem is that it raises that dilemma of whether it's shifting responsibility back to the individual by saying, well, we don't need to change anything in terms of the infrastructure. It's all about making sure the technology is available, and if it's there, then you're fine. But I think we've got to be very careful of how this may put ownership back onto people in order to have their needs met, in order to be part of that environment or be part of the community.
Yes, and from my perspective, so the primary user group that we're concerned with in the research in the Bristol Robotics Lab and in designability are older adults with aging-related impairments. One of the issues that we are seeing today, according to statistics from Age UK, it says social isolation is of growing concern, and at present, over 2 million people aged over 75, that's nearly half of the population, 49%, live alone. And so one of the things that is important to consider is how could these technologies help people to connect together, and how could it address social isolation issues.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just to add to that from Linda, I think we've seen examples of that where that has worked quite successfully. So, for example, if we think of how the gaming culture, the gaming society has emerged and developed with the advancement of technology, we now have disabled and non-disabled people existing in a social network of building alliances, building collaborations, building friendship with people from all over the world. Over a certain point, in this case would be gaming. I think this allows us to open up those possibilities of trying to address the issue of isolation.
Yes, yes, and one of the other things that I'm particularly interested in is how could this technology support intergenerational communication more and connectivity. And you mentioned the gaming side, and gaming is a key part of this. In our D4D project, one of the core themes which we looked at with one of our late collaborators, Dr. Sue Porter, was around connecting with the environment through walks. So I'm very keen to explore as to how this technology might be able to help people in that way. One of the things I would be interested in is joining in classroom activities, so older adults perhaps using this to support individual reading for children in class. Or it could be through this, a grandparent could be helping a grandchild with showing them how to follow through on a recipe or cook through this. So the grandchild has one of these, and then the grandparent, who might be in a different continent even, could use this. And you mentioned this about cooking, didn't you, in your home?
Yeah, I did. I thought it was interesting because after I'd played around with the technology, I was talking to my partner and family, and we were saying, well, actually, sometimes when I have to go to bed because of my energy levels and so on, my partner will be in the kitchen making dinner for all of us. But if I want to engage, I have to kind of shout from the bedroom, or I need to get on Skype and I'm going to be fixed in one location. Whereas using this allows me to have control over my mobility within that environment. And again, it goes back to that point of choice of control. Because yes, you can have video conferencing, and you can have FaceTime and WhatsApp video and so on. But I think this goes back to that point about mobility and moving around the environment how you want to move around it, irrespective of what that environment may provide in terms of barriers and stuff. So I think it will build towards providing new roles and responsibilities for people, whether that's in the home or whether that's in the learning environment or in the work environment and so on. Because again, if I think about my responsibility as a teacher, the idea of having all my students coming into the room at that certain time, having to be there to engage, that's just reinforcing the normality of what it means to teach in that environment.
Yeah.
Whereas what this provides is a mechanism for people who would say, well, because of perhaps caring responsibility or access requirements or geographical locations and so forth, I can still participate in that environment. Yeah. So this is technology is as much about providing a tool for people to use as it is about disrupting our current practices of doing things.
Yeah. So I've been given the 10 minutes as the 20-minute signal already, Miro. So we've got that other second question about disabled people's movements. Maybe we can go on to the next slide and sort of pick up on that. So the next theme is about impact on provision of human support. And so one of the things that we've been discussing is how this will change the provision of service design and delivery. And this is very pertinent from the point of view of gatekeepers and that theme about who is going to control and how is this going to have an impact. Looking at it in a more positive way, so my working with carers and clinicians, one of the things that we are finding is that with the growing aging demographic, one of the issues is by 2030 there'll be a shortage of 2 million carers across Europe. And that is very significant into being able to maintain high quality of care. And so I've been working with carers to explore how this technology could be used to provide expert care for somebody who might need it on a more frequent basis. So for instance, somebody receiving physiotherapy or speech therapy after stroke, they might have somebody visiting them 3 times a week. We are looking to see whether this technology would enable as therapists to visit the person, visit inverted commas, more frequently, and hence improve the impact of the therapy. So, and because if you think about people based in more rural locations where you have to take into account travel distances as well as the time involved in sitting through, Bristol is particularly bad for traffic jams. This could mean that experts are able to see more people in the given time. But my concerns regarding this, and this is part of the research that we're doing, is how could this affect the quality of the experience for the person receiving the care and also for the person providing the care. And Miro, you had made a comment about the training needs and roles.
Yeah, I think just to, hold on, let me just take a little bit back. I think this is where I'm interested in trying to bridge the relationship between technology and politics and economics, because we've seen the rhetoric and the language being used where when technology has been rolled out or advanced in terms of providing new opportunities for the way we access different environments and use it for different purposes, we've tended to equate technology to meaning removing the need for human interaction. And I think this is where we have to be very careful that when this technology, or if this technology is rolled out and developed further, the relationships and the interactions between decision makers, policy designers, commissioners, and even parliamentarians and so forth need to recognize that this is not about advancing technology as a way of reducing the cost of having a human interaction. So rather than saying, this is about having a clinician be able to speak to 3 or 4 different people within the space of an hour as opposed to seeing one person face to face. It's more about saying, well, does the use of technology give the person closer control and more time to do the things they want to do themselves? And is the provision of the technology a choice for the individual? Because we don't want to see it being an imposed and applied to the individual, irrespective of whether they want it or not. So this is much about explaining the technology as a tool to be utilized by the person, which should be owned by the person, and therefore it still requires it in collaboration with human interaction and so forth. So using the technology now, I still need to have access to my personal assistant who helps me if my hand falls off the keyboard or if my arm gets tired or takes the headphones off and so forth. So it's about packaging this idea in a collaborative effort between the two, which then means that the role of a PA and the role of the individual will also need to have support to understand how the technology should be used, how it should be rolled out, how it should be used in different environments, and what it actually offers the individual in the long run as well.
Yes, and I think, you know, for the second question, how do we ensure that it's not monopolized, which you've touched on. One of the issues that we're facing in terms of the gatekeeping, etc., is to get through the various hoops in being able to test and trial this technology. And that is acting as a real sort of bottleneck in exploring the issues. And one of the things that is of concern for me, and particularly from a research perspective, is that if we are not able to roll out this technology and trial it quickly with people to understand what these issues are and also be able to discuss and debate aspects around ownership, then, you know, we might have a situation where people just make decisions on it being used without having gone through that process of having explored and trialed it from all the different perspectives.
And I think this is why we need to ensure the relationship between the designers, the engineers, the academics who want to kind of philosophize about technology and so forth, or working in collaboration with salespeople and the salespeople's organizations. Because it's not about saying that the technology should be provided to the clinicians and the commissioners, who will then decide who has access to it, which reinforces that notion of deserving and undeserving. It's about saying, well, the relation has to be horizontal one between the developers and the people who will actually use it in the long run. So the focus of ownership always remains at that grassroots level between the individual who's using it and the person who's designing it. Because that will be very easily manipulated, I think, going forward. And we have demonstration of how that has been manipulated in the past. And therefore, we need to try and use the arguments around independent living. And when I say independent living, I mean the term defined and created by the disabled people's movement. And we wanting activists to actually see the benefit of this and to question it and to critique it. But they need to be supported and resourced to be working alongside the developers.
Yes, you've talked about independent living, and this is quite an interesting aspect that has emerged and has got me to reflect more, particularly with my involvement in the D4D project. So there is a paradox of independence in terms of the fact that one can see technology as providing the independence. However, one of the things that has emerged is about interdependence and the fact that we still need humans there, other people, to support us, even though we might have that technology. So in terms of independence, one of the things that could happen, and I'd like your view on this, is does dependence start to have a negative connotation? And what about dependence on technology? And how does that affect human relationships?
Mm-hmm. So I think the independent living movement and the disabled people's movement and the various activists, prominent activists and campaigners around disability rights have always tried to struggle to retain or reclaim the language of independent living. Because if we look at the early activism, grassroots movements, the focus was always saying independent living means having the right level of support to do the things you want to do with your life. And that's been hijacked and manipulated by those in power. It means something very different, which means doing things for yourself on your own, which then leads to people rejecting it because they recognize they do need support of others. And it also leads to justification for removing services and so forth. So this is about using the medium of the technology to go back to those early conversations and say the emergence of vulnerability and dependency has come at a time in order to restrict access to services and so forth. And what we're saying here is that we want to question whether technology like this will it allow and permit people to have the right level of support to do the things they want to do with their life in their own communities and so forth. But that's going to be skewed very easily because we will have, I can see it very easily. Policymakers, commissioners and so on say, well, you can only have access to this technology if you're in education or if you're working in meaningful employment and so forth. And what we don't want to do is have this used as a part of the narrative to say, well, once you got this, you don't need a PA. Or once you got this, there should be no excuse as to why you're not in work and so forth. Because what we're trying to say is the same people. We want to be valued and respected in society. The question is, does this provide a platform for us to achieve that? Or does it reinforce the objectives of those with power at the moment?
Okay. So So I think this takes us nicely into the last theme we're going to look at, which is around usability and participatory design. So it's about how do we facilitate inclusion and find out about the actual issues by working with people. So from my perspective in the design of these technologies, the ease of access to the controls from an ergonomic point of view, depending on that person's level of disability, which can be around mobility impairment, visual impairment, or hearing impairment, is a crucial aspect of the success or the effectiveness of these technologies. So it was interesting that a few weeks ago, we have another telepresence robot in the lab called PadBot. And Mira had to go with that as well, and then you had to go on double. And then can you say a little bit about usability and accessibility from your experience?
I can do, yeah. So when Parminder spoke to me about the idea of having two robots that have a similar use and purpose, but they may feel different for you, I was a bit naive because I thought, well, it'll be the same, won't it? But what I found was when I used the PadBot, which is the one I'm not using today, because the one today is called the double. When I used a PadBot, I realized I had to use it through a phone, which was convenient in one sense, because I thought, well, I can go out, I can do my things, I can just log in when necessary. But then I realized, well, because of my limitations of the body, I have to hold it in a certain way. So then I have to get somebody else to hold it for me, or I have to try and change the way I'm sitting in order to use it. And it was very frustrating. It got to the point where I thought, actually, I couldn't be bothered using this on a daily basis. I don't see the point of how this would address some of my access needs and the barriers that I face. But when I used the double robot, which is this one, it actually became more beneficial because I could sit at my desk and I can carry on working and I can do all the things I'm doing and just log in and move around and interact when necessary. So, and it made me think just before when I was coming on stage, because if I was there physically now, I would probably be thinking, what points do I need to remember? Because I'm not going to be able to hold the papers in front of me. I can't use my phone with my electronic copy of my notes. I've also got to hold my hand on the joystick to drive and so forth. So this allows me to present in a better way because I've got half my computer screen dedicated to seeing you, and half my screen dedicated to my notes. And also, if I get really bored, I can just look right and start watching television if I wanted to. But we can see then that the rollout of technology, from a designer's point of view and an engineer's point of view, doesn't just mean the same but in different versions. It means the relationship between the individual and their access need and the barriers they want to address is all contributing to whether the technology becomes useful or not. And the only way we can address that is by ensuring disabled people's organizations and our archives capture these important conversations, but ensuring that disabled people and activists and DPOs and people involved in disability studies are part of the conversation with those within robotics to ensure that this becomes accessible, but more importantly, useful to disabled people.
Yes, yeah. And so the implications for rolling out this technology and providing it, what sort of issues do you think technologists should think about?
Sorry, say again.
So what should we engineers be thinking about?
I think firstly this issue of ownership. And we've seen a lot of conversation around...
I missed that, sorry.
Sorry, so the issue of ownership.
Ownership, yeah.
Because we've seen the rollout of automation of technology in public transport, in car manufacturing and industry and so forth. And we've seen a number of people within the political spectrum talk about saying, well, if technology is rolled out and does replace jobs or changes role and responsibility, the ownership of the technology should be by the worker or the individual who's going to be utilizing it. So I think that's the first point we need to think about. I think the second point is how this relates to social class. Because we know that disability is dependent on social class. If you have more wealth and opportunities and power, then your removal of societal barriers would be somewhat easier than those who are in poverty and those who are in the working class and so forth. And what I don't want to see is the expensiveness and the cost of this robot or technology being placed on the individual, whereby then we would create a hierarchy of people who can afford it will use it and will build an opportunity to progress forward in their life and so forth, and those who can't afford it or who are deemed to be undeserving of the support will have no access to it. And I think very quickly, finally, is thinking of how this changes our understanding of disability in a global sense. Because we know that in parts of the world that will have no access to technology, does not have the infrastructure to build the network around it in order to use the technology. And we don't want to become activists or engineers who then try to colonize the issues affecting disabled people in other parts of the world by saying, well, we have the technology, we're going to help you, we're going to save you. It's about saying, how do we ensure this technology is available to others around the world, irrespective of where we are, but then provided with the support to be in the driving seat of where it will take them and where it will be.
Yes, I think that sort of brings us nicely to our final thoughts and conclusions, which you've just given. And for me, one of the key things are around whether this technology, how and whether it helps to connect people better. And the thing about possible economic issues becoming a barrier is quite scary, which can happen. These are not that cheap, particularly once you start to get to something more sophisticated. I can say for the double, it's actually thinking about it from a health economics perspective is quite reasonable. So 2,500 will get you the double and the iPad that goes with it. And so that does mean you're already considering buying one, aren't you, Miro?
Well, I thought, it was interesting because when we talked about it before, I finished my PhD in January and I'm offered teaching positions all over the country. Because of health and social care policy, I can't leave my locality because my support package will be scrapped and there'll be a question whether I get it. So I can't accept positions in other parts of the country. But if I was to use a double and the institution where I may go and teach or lecture were happy to use it and saw the benefit of it, I could spend some part of the week in a different place. I could then teach through the robot and allow me then to ensure that I've got my support. That doesn't get away from the issue of the system is unfair providing support, but it provides a window of opportunity to progress forward while continuing that demand for change.
So one of the things, actually, Sue was when she was talking to you, she raised the other question, which is a big issue in developing assistive technology, is the aesthetics, the design. Does it look desirable? Are people quite happy to have it? And that is a big issue. And she suggested doing something to personalize it. So for your students, would you be interested in personalizing your look in any way?
I think I think I could happily put that out to my students, see if they want to decorate me, although I'd be scared of the results.
Okay, so I think we'll stop there, and we'd love to have questions from you and your thoughts. Oh, did we not have a question from you? Okay.
Any questions?
Sorry, you're talking to me?
What does it achieve that a disc and a couple of CDs don't do?
The question, Miro, I don't know if you heard it, was
No, I couldn't.
What does this achieve, which a couple of discs and CDs, so I guess general computing can't. What does this achieve?
For me, it goes back to that point of having mobility to move around the environment. So if I was to join you by Skype, then it would be dependent on Preminder placing the laptop in the position where I want it and so forth. I have no control about moving around the environment. So this gives me the opportunity to interact. It also gives me the opportunity to decide where we will go and who I will form interactions or conversations with. And again, in a teaching environment, for example, I could quite easily see it where I can lecture from the front, and then I can go up to different tables and talk to students. Or in terms of being in my home, I lie on a bed and I can't go and talk to my partner who might be in a living room, and then I might want to go and talk to my nephew in a different room. But I can't do that if I've got to rely on somebody else to carry the technology around. Whereas this goes back to that issue of autonomy and choice and control in that environment.
Yeah, you can do a little, oh, some feedback. You can do a little 360 to show your mobility, a little dance. You've got a camera at the bottom as well, so you can see where you are. You're particularly close to my chair.
Oh, sorry. I'll move away.
I don't mind.
Hello. Which mic am I using? Both mics. Okay, yeah, absolutely fascinating. I'm interested to know what your experience of us is like. You know, how clearly you see us, how well you hear us on your side of the conversation over there.
So I think, because the sound isn't great, but I think the question was, what's my perception of all of you?
Yeah, how clear are you hearing us? How well are you seeing us on the other side?
Yeah. So I can see very well, and I have options to change that as well. So I can change the bandwidth of the speed of the connection, which may mean that I can reduce the quality of the visual, but it may keep it stable and so forth. We've been playing around with sound and audio for some time. It still requires people to speak quite loudly and quite close in order to be able to understand what you're saying. I mean, when you're using the technology, and I've used it now since about 10 o'clock this morning, you feel immersed in it. So although I can break out and talk to the people, or I can do a few things, or send emails and so on, I feel like I'm there. You know, I went around before, I looked at the kind of harbour side and looked out and so forth, and I caught up with people I haven't seen for a while, and you just feel totally immersed in it. So I don't think there's a major issue around that. But it's an adjustment period, like any technology is. And it's about ensuring that the individual has the right support in order to utilize it and access it and so on.
Have you got mono or stereo audio?
I missed that, sorry.
Is it mono or stereo, the audio that you receive?
It's mono, I think.
So actually one of the things that we're interested in developing from the robotics point of view is helping to give the person teleoperating the robot more awareness of the context. So for instance, you know, Mira won't know if I go behind him and make faces. So it would be good to have awareness of people around you. We're also looking at how we can add more sensors to it to make it safer to operate. The PadBot, the other one, the advantage of that is that it does have more sensors. So it won't let Mira take a flying leap off the stage. Whereas this one, he could if he was, but he's not going to. And also, one of the things that I would like to explore in future research is around being able to give the person teleoperating Mira here more of a sense of the feel of the place. We experience space through all our senses, so understanding how that could be done is an interesting research challenge. There was another question, I think.
I found it quite telling because I watched you lead the robot down the aisle, as if you were sort of bringing a dog down it. But to get onto the stage, you physically had to put your hand on it and pick it up.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's really telling. When you consider that we have several wheelchair users in here as well, it's very telling.
Yes, yes, it is. And we did try getting it up the ramp, and Mira looked. We tried getting it up the ramp. You can see the ramp there behind you, Mira on the other side, the ramp, and it's too steep. And even somebody in a wheelchair, it was Esther saying it was steep for her as well. So one of the things that actually could be quite interesting to explore accessibility of spaces is to try it out with technologies such as this. If this can't make it onto the stage on its own, then people have to do more to improve the environment. So even here, the connectivity, the internet connectivity is not that great. When we go to the exhibition side, in the MShed wireless connection doesn't allow for the double to connect. It requires special settings, etc. So it's not just about the physical barriers that we have to address, which are going to be the same for technology such as this, but also the networking barriers. But one of the things that I was asking Mira if he would like would be a drone with a camera, which would mean that he'd be able to hover and come and be next to you when you wanted, whisper in your ear. Yeah, that would be an interesting one to explore as well. Mira, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I do actually. I think this goes back to the point before. By ensuring that the provision of this technology is still a choice. So if I want to be there in a physical way in my power chair, then I still have the option to do that. And I think the universal design option of this technology and its application from a universal point of view. So by saying, not just disabled people can use this, but those who need to work from home for a variety of different reasons, or those who can't attend for a variety of different reasons. If this becomes a popular choice of technology for people to use, irrespective of their background, then we would see the environment change very quickly in order to become accessible. The only reason why we have a steep ramp on the side of the stage is because the majority of people who use this stage will be non-wheelchair users. Because if the majority of people were wheelchair users, then the ramp would have been changed a long time ago, and the environment itself would have been changed to meet the needs of the majority of people who use it. And that's why we have barriers in the first place, is because disabled people are a minority, and therefore their access needs are pushed aside and dismissed for the benefit of those who don't have those access needs. So I think if this technology was become popular and was to be used by people from all different backgrounds, I think I would presume and kind of guess that our infrastructures and our environments where we would use the technology would adapt very quickly to be accessible and to be reliable for the technology.
I think, to be honest with you, it's something that we've been saying for probably more than 2 decades. It isn't our impairments that disable us, it's society.
Yeah, it's not our impairments that disable us, it's society. There was a question there in the front. Okay, yes. Question?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that one of the things is getting people to accept things that are really helpful to them. And one of the best ways I've found of doing that is peer support. You get one person who's found it useful, and then they tell other people like themselves that it might be useful, and supporting them in that is really valuable. For instance, I belong to a social networking site online for visually impaired people. We got members all around the world, and one of the things we do is teach people technology. And for instance, somebody was paying a human being to go to their house 40 quid just to show them how to create a folder, because they didn't believe that a blind person could do it for themselves. You know, another visually impaired person on the network said, I can teach you to do that in 10 minutes. And now she's saying, why on earth was I paying all this money all these years to get somebody else to do what I could do myself? So getting people like yourself to support you in learning and accepting advantages like this is really important.
Yeah, you are to become an advocate for this, I think.
Was there a question over here?
Thank you. One of the things I was really interested in hearing was about how it's felt that the technology should be rolled out to the cultural and heritage and other sectors like that. And I'm really interested in that because one of my interests is accessibility in buildings. And I can see how, for example, a castle, which can't always be adapted to be accessible. So there's nowhere to put a lift, for instance, if there's all this stone infrastructure. Instead of having a static virtual reality environment of the upper floors, there's the possibility for someone to travel up by themselves in a virtual way, and it makes it a much more meaningful experience. I can really see the potential for that technology, so you could enjoy a day out with your family and things like that. And I really see I really see the possibilities of this.
Yes, it's got good possibilities in accessing environments, and we're hoping for our D4D project. One of the things that we're going to be doing is to get people to experience another place and space. So, for instance, a museum such as this, to have the opportunity to wander about a night at the museum, maybe, and get the experience of places where they wouldn't have access. Where would be your favorite place that you want to visit through this, Miro?
Through this? Oh, that's a hard one. I suppose we'll go back to the idea of the drone for a second. When you told me about the idea of having the drone and being able to drive around, fly around with the screen, the first thing I thought was, when I started dating and I got with my partner, she was a very keen hiker and kind of mountaineering and so forth. And of course, I can't share that with her because the terrain is accessible for my power chair wheelchair. But that would allow me an opportunity where I can, again, stay from my environment, but interact and have that opportunity to go to parts in the rural areas and in the countryside, which is not accessible for wheelchair users at the moment. But the point, again, it goes back to that point of being at the moment, because as one of our colleagues in the audience said, it's about shifting that responsibility away from the individual's impairments and health conditions to recognizing that the barriers we face are societal. And as a committed follower of the social model of disability, I completely agree with that and echo that. Again, for me, it's a question of saying, does this allow us to access environments which are currently inaccessible, but still provide us with the methods and the mechanism to put pressure and demand to change it so that using this technology is a choice rather than a necessity.
Okay, thank you. And I think, there's one more question.
Yeah, I just had one question, Praminda, specifically about the point of social isolation that you mentioned about. On the technological front, I've got no doubt that the technological barriers that kind of currently exist, and the questions that the gentleman just there had about double being able to access the ramp. I mean, there's already technology being developed by, I think it's the Zurich Institute of Technology with their Skiro chair that uses similar gyroscope technology within this, that it also uses to have a stair climbing wheelchair that can even go up spiral staircases, an incredible bit of kit, which I think is going to come online and be available commercially in the autumn of 2018. So next year. So the technological issues will be solved. As Mira was talking about being able to see from a camera's eye point of view on a drone. Well, there are already drones that you can get. They're the size of an iPhone with 4 little fans in them that you could send up to 20 or 30 feet for doing the ultimate selfie from some kind of elevation, which is also exciting. But I was thinking from the point that you made about social isolation. My mother, for instance, has Alzheimer's. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be great if there was some kind of infrastructure that could allow the application of something like this, so where you could piggyback the available infrastructure, perhaps even through the care system, where you had individual people that had attended some kind of training seminar to know how to apply the technology, to take it to the end user's house, to allow them to communicate with their family. So if, for instance, they had some kind of impairment, say with Alzheimer's or some form of dementia, that didn't allow them to articulate being able to use the technology directly themselves, that person who would be instructed how to use it could, in the process of their normal duties, maybe a little bolt-on or something during their half-hour or 1-hour visit, could also do something where that individual were able to communicate with their family. And then that addresses those issues of social
isolation. But also, as an extension to that, you could be looking at education or the potential to travel in some kind of sense.
Yes.
So all of the applications become very, very enriching from a multiple kind of perspective. I think the technology is fantastic and hugely exciting as to what's going to happen in the next 5 or so years. Yeah.
Definitely, hugely exciting. And I think what the key point you made, Bernie, is about making this something that becomes a norm. So you have the opportunity and you have the networks and you have the infrastructure support to enable more people to use it. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about in the work that I do in the robotics lab is to make sure that the technology that we're using and we're evaluating is affordable. And that's going to be the key for success. Okay, so thank you. Okay. Esther is just going to come up this round.
Sure.
Mira, if you go into parking, then I'll just put you down.
Just a few words from me, because I think really today has just been the day to hear all the other speakers, and I think I just want to say a huge thank you really to everybody that's been involved in today. I hope that it's given you lots of food for thought. What we intended to do at the beginning of the day was to really explore this idea about whose voices aren't really heard, looking at that both historically and in the future, and how we can address that imbalance and think about correcting those power imbalances, and also thinking about who have been those gatekeepers in the past and who they might be in the future. And as I said at the beginning of the day, it's really important that this conversation doesn't stop here and that it isn't just happening in these walls, but that we start to kind of share these conversations more widely. So please do look at the live stream again once we get a file of the final day. Also do get involved on the hashtag Gatekeepers. I think there's been quite a lot of Twitter happening today, so that we can kind of continue that conversation and see where we can go next. But thank you all for your really willing contributions, and particularly to the speakers. Thank you.